Welcome, Lucy. I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us today. So, I really love hearing everyone's stories. What was your first experience with Ayurveda?
Yeah, so in at the end of 2012, I was traveling in India with a really good girlfriend of mine, and we were both kind of like getting into yoga. I guess she had been like practicing for a little bit longer than me, and I was trying to find my way in, and we were having a great trip and great travels together. And I'll just personify the doshas a little bit in this conversation, just like for a bit of humor, I guess. She's like more predominant Vata type. So up early in the morning, ready to go, excited for handstands in yoga and, kind of more dynamic asana practice. And myself, like I'm a little more kapha in nature. Early morning yoga was probably not what I was like very excited for. And so I was exploring the area and I started to see these Ayurveda clinics, and I kind of understood quickly that yoga and Ayurveda were very connected, and I was like quite intrigued. I'd heard a little bit about it before being in India. And then I found out about things like Abhyanga, which is like warm oil body massage. And I just really got into going and having some Ayurveda treatments. And so I felt like at the time that was, instead of going to yoga, I could go to Ayurveda. And for my constitution, that felt very luxurious. And so we were both exploring, and my first experience then was like a very experiential situation. I didn't really understand the nuance of what was happening, but yeah, it felt lovely. And it was like at a time that was full of learning and growth. And we were both learning about Jyotish and having experiences with things in India. And yeah, the Vedic sciences were just very alive and very exciting. So that was probably my first touch point of Ayurveda.
I like the sound of the hot oil massages.
Yeah.
That sounds like very much me as well. And then what really drew you into wanting to study Ayurveda?
Yeah, I guess I did my first yoga teacher training, which was like a 200-hour yoga teacher training. And I was just so fortunate that one of the facilitators on that training was an Ayurvedic practitioner. And so I got to hear more about Ayurveda and kind of broken down into the principles of Ayurveda and how that was connected to my yoga practice. And both those sciences were kind of emerging together in dialogue, which was just really fascinating for me and really satiated my curiosity. And then, it just starts, and then I feel like it just kept growing. I started listening to teachers. I was introduced to teachers like Dr. Robert Svoboda, Dr. Vasant Lad, Dr. Claudia Welsh as kind of references to start exploring more about Ayurveda. And the more I listened, the more it made sense to me. And it's really like couldn't stop. And my curiosity just kept growing. The more I learned, the more it made sense to me. And then I was living in Darwin in the Northern Territory, and I just decided that I really wanted to take the next step in my studies. And Dr. Vasant Lad has a school. It's now on the East Coast, but at the time it was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Ayurvedic Institute. And I just had to go and study. And almost it seemed like a ridiculous, huge move to make, to move overseas, to commit to a 2-year program. It was a 2-year full-time program in Albuquerque. And there was a bit of resistance to make that change of like my whole life. But a few things happened that maybe sound a bit strange, but the local organic fruit and veggie shop called me one day and they said, "Oh, Lucy, someone's brought in a whole lot of Ayurveda texts for you." And I thought, I wasn't really often in like phone conversation with the store. So I went in, there was a huge tub of all the textbooks of Ayurveda. To this day, we don't even know who that person was that left them for me. And then down south in Victoria, my aunt and uncle, they were in an op shop, like a secondhand store. And my uncle's in the book section, and he found what wasn't in the box at the fruit and veggie store, every Ayurveda and yoga text by Dr. Vasant Lad and Dr. Frawley, all these books, in pretty much new condition. And he brought them all for $2. So there was these things happening that felt like, I don't know, maybe you say a sign, but like a bit of a push to say, like, here's everything you need to use for your studies. And those things happened. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go.
Yeah. Those sound like very obvious, like universal, like this is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. And I don't really, I wouldn't make that claim, but those two seemed pretty like obvious kind of prompts to make some decisions.
Crazy. I love that. So then you went and studied, and you've been studying Ayurveda for about 10 years.
Yeah. About 10 years studying with Dr. Lad in the States was a pretty incredible opportunity. I'd often like say to people, yeah, I'm studying Ayurveda, and they'd say, where are you? And in New Mexico and in Albuquerque, and it didn't really seem like a logical place to be. But if you know the story of Dr. Lad, he's a pretty significant teacher of Ayurveda, and especially in bringing Ayurveda to the West and making that available for students really all over. The first textbooks in English, translating from Sanskrit, like it's a huge gift to all of
Beautiful.
us who are pursuing studies in Ayurveda.
And then how did you decide to start working with yoga teachers?
Well, that's actually quite a recent pivot, like over this last 18 months, I'd say. Previous to studying Ayurveda, I've been a high school art teacher for about 13 years. So teaching is something that's a real sweet spot for me. There's nothing I love more than a group of people getting together and learning something and exploring, especially in creative ways. And so running any kind of Ayurveda clinic, for anyone who is doing that and listening, we know like ordering oils, staying across herbs, keeping all those kinds of things moving, which is part of Ayurvedic protocol, is a pretty epic undertaking. And just more and more, I found what I really loved was being with groups of people and talking about Ayurveda, because it's such a joy for me to see people learn something about Ayurveda and then try it out in their own lives and feel how much benefit can happen just by learning this process of logic and application of the elements. So I guess that joy kind of made me decide to just hone in on that area.
And okay, so I want to cover some of the basics. So what is Ayurveda?
Yeah, so Ayurveda is so commonly described as the science of life, Arya and Veda being life and science. And I think that's a great launch point. But I also think the science of life is such a huge statement because we'd have to really break that down. Like, what does that mean for each person and individually? So I like starting with Ayurveda and the definition of health, because I think that's a nice pathway in or access point. And Ayurveda defines health as our balanced tissues, our balanced bodily humours, a balanced waste of the body, a balanced mind, blissful senses. The definition of health just is so broad, and it's so broad compared to anything else I've really heard when it comes to what is health. And so Ayurveda is about learning all the aspects of the body. There's body, mind, and then spirit. In Ayurveda, we wouldn't say we affect spirit, but like by getting the body mind balance in, then we can live with this kind of state of flow or ease or harmony. And Ayurveda accepts that everything is made of the 5 elements. So the 5 elements being ether or space, air, fire, water, and earth. And so while our bodies are made up of that, also the world around us is made up of the same 5 elements. And so when we learn deeply what the elements are and what they're made of and what their effects are, then we can make choices that position us in a way that we can feel more connected. We can feel more in flow. We can feel that when we talk about creating balance, Ayurveda, I feel like really explains what are the parts that we put together to create balance. And so it's very beautiful, but it's also very practical.
So what are some of the sort of practical things that we can do to fit Ayurveda into our daily lives in a Western sense?
Yeah. Okay. So my social media account, right? I'm always seeing things about oil pulling or tongue scraping and eating porridge. And there's so many really basic options. Basic's probably not the right word, but there's so many ways in which we can apply Ayurveda. So from the classical text, there's things that we learn about, like, sipping on hot water during the day, but that helps us kindle our Agni, or what we call our digestive strength, digestive fire, scraping the tongue, there's these practices that these like lifestyle practices we can do, and we can learn what they are. And then what I think is even more interesting is engaging with study, because then you understand, like, what is it about these practices that makes it beneficial, and then we can apply that same logic to the rest of our lives. Like, Ayurveda uses lots of spices like cumin, coriander, fennel, and they all have qualities, which is why they impact us all in different ways depending on the qualities that we have. And so if we're living in places outside of India, Sri Lanka, we can also learn that some other spices that we have growing in our garden, like rosemary, parsley, basil, they also have qualities that affect us too. And so when we sort of learn the why and the how in Ayurveda, then we can apply it in whatever life that we're living.
I love that. Just thinking about some of these daily things a little bit more intentionally and what goes behind them.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we think about Ayurveda as like a long list of things that you might have to do in the morning. So really, Ayurveda should be meeting us where we are so that we can start incrementally doing things to see which things give us the most amount of support. And it's almost like we want to do the lazy version because we want to have the most amount of impact from the least amount of effort. So for me, I might have 3 things that really affect my system in a profound way. And they could be very different from the 3 things that you might use in your morning. So Ayurveda celebrates our diversity in a way, because it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's looking at each individual and our makeup, right? Like, so how do the elements come together to create me the way I am? And how have they come together to make you the way you are, and that we are all these expressions of consciousness or expressions of nature that are inherently going to be different. And then how do we find the gunas or the elements around us that we can meet and feel our most well expression?
So instead of like just giving you a huge big to-do list, finding what actually fits in with your constitution.
Yeah. And I think that that's sort of how I like to think about yoga and Ayurveda going together, because yoga is such a wonderful way of building awareness and our capacity to register and observe sensations in the body. And so when we might learn something about Ayurveda, and then you can observe the effects for yourself, right? They might be different to what the Instagram post says, right? And we kind of like building that relationship with our own bodies and our own understanding of our bodies in space and at different times of our lives, and knowing whether that's right for us at a particular time or not. Maybe it's something else.
And you mentioned people often think of it as being like a list. Are there any other big misconceptions around Ayurveda that you see often?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to so many people in clinic space, and there's so many misconceptions. I guess that happens, doesn't it? Like when there's something that we don't really know about, we kind of fill it in with different bits and pieces. So people coming in with like a list and saying, I can't get all this done before, 5 a.m. I mean, who knows what jobs people have, right? Like you don't want to feel like you've like failed at a list before you've even started your day. That would not be an Ayurvedic approach to anything. I think that there's misconceptions around that it's a vegetarian diet, or that people have to give up everything. Coffee is something that people come in like often a little fearful, or they state straight from the beginning that I'm not willing to give up my coffee. And I think back to being in school with Dr. Lad, and he would say, we're not in the job of taking away people's pleasure. And so we don't want to get fixated on any health trends. You don't want to step away from the premise that Ayurveda isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So yeah, people come in worried about that. And yeah, I think people are living like big, lives, and they don't want to come to a health practitioner that's going to tell them that they're wrong, that they have to do all these things and change a whole lot. I think that if that happens, then maybe redirect to find somewhere that doesn't make you feel that way about your choices.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's a lot probably from people going into like GPs or something, or the
Yeah.
dentist. Remember going to the dentist one time, and the first time she's like, "Oh, your teeth are great," and I don't really have any teeth problems. And then the next time I went in, she was like, "Oh, they're great, but you've got to do all this." And I'm like, "Last time you said it was fine, and they're still fine. Stop lecturing me."
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think people are often like just doing their best with what they've got. And, I think that same attitude happens too in this wellness industry, right? We have to kind of keep a check on the fact that is an industry that is happening. And so whilst there could be, a million ways we could always refine and do things better, yeah, we don't want to be demonizing small things that sometimes aren't as big of a drama as they can be made out to be.
And making it feel unattainable, I guess, as well. If you're going to be like, no, you have to stop everything that you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, because then what are we doing to somebody? It's like wellness is the whole person, right? Like there's ideals and then there's reality and then there's like the journey that happens in between.
Mm. And so we know in Western culture that yoga, and more specifically, I mean, asana with this, has really boomed, especially since the 60s, but arguably even more in the past decade, with Instagram trends making the postures very popular. And we've also got internet making classes more available to a lot of people. And I think asana especially has been glommed onto because it is that very visual, physical aspect. So it's kind of easier to immediately connect with for a lot of people. But as many of us know, as yoga teachers, yoga's even more than that. You've been studying for Ayurveda for years now. Have you seen any shifts in people's understanding of the practice?
Yes, there's like lots to say, isn't there? I really appreciate that this is part of your conversation on this podcast because I think that the more we talk about it, the more voices we get to hear around some of those nuances. I think I might be a bit idealistic in some ways, and I have this vision that by bringing Ayurveda to yoga, it kind of expands the conversation even more because asana is part of yoga, as we know, and that through an Ayurvedic lens, we use asana in a particular way depending on what is happening in the body. So I think that part of it also like starts to broaden people's understanding. Same with pranayama. And so I would like to think that by bringing yoga and Ayurveda together, we can start to kind of loosen that grip and focus on asana that is definitely very visible. I do see probably a similar trend happening though in Ayurveda, even just on like social media, like the things that you can post about. I know that Ayurvedic nutrition and Ayurvedic food is a really big part of Ayurveda and can be such an incredible access point for people to start experiencing how to take care of themselves or choosing different foods that can be supportive. But yeah, I feel a little tentative around that just because, food and disordered eating or access and all those sorts of things, they're like, it's all really close and it's all really connected. And so, yeah, I think that by bringing yoga and Ayurveda together and then yoga, Ayurveda and Jyotish, it just like expands the conversation. And hopefully will direct the focus to some of the more historical aspects of yoga, some of the voices of yoga, or some of the voices that have been, excluded from the conversation. It's exciting that there's more people on these platforms, with the words like decolonizing yoga. These conversations are coming into the mainstream more. So I might be too idealistic, but I feel hopeful that is going to take a hold in more places.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that you use the word entry points because I think that we all have to find an entry point somewhere. And then it's good that more of these conversations are coming up because then people are more aware that this was actually just an entry point. This is not the whole thing that I'm learning.
Yeah, exactly. And those little points might feel a little uncomfortable. They might make us feel some sensation, but that's a great invitation to explore further.
Yeah, exactly. And we've talked a little bit about how Ayurveda and yoga are related, but how are they connected? They are kind of together and kind of separate.
Yeah, they're kind of together and they're kind of separate. And I just think about it, I'm really thinking about folks who are living in this world, but what we translate as like the householder, which I know is like a bit somewhat of a problematic translation, but like I just mean people who might be like caring for a family, so caring in their community, going to work most days a week, in some of those more traditional roles. And so in that space, yoga and Ayurveda go very well together because the body is where we're experiencing this through. It's like the primary site of our experience. And Ayurveda is tending to the body. It's like the platform. It's the home of the experience. So if we can like strengthen that and create like a strong foundations, it helps carry us through. I'm seeing lots of stuff about yoga for the nervous system on my social media at the moment, which is great, and people going to yoga because they feel calm. It helps them balance out after a busy day. So we're using yoga in almost a very Ayurvedic way, like to bring balance. So if there's been overstimulation through the day or too much mobility, we would say in Ayurveda, going to a restorative yoga class or people going to a yin yoga class, not really actually across yin yoga to that extent, but I could say restorative yoga, right, where there's more stability, less movement. So that's where like opposites are creating balance. So yoga and Ayurveda, they really go so nicely together for anyone who's trying to live their lives with sort of equilibrium, I guess is a nice word.
And how does having an understanding of Ayurveda specifically help yoga teachers?
Yeah, so studying the body through the lens of Ayurveda for yoga teachers brings together so much of what yoga teachers already know and gives a really tangible framework. So, for example, Ayurvedic anatomy is really fantastic for yoga teachers to understand, like how our tissues layer, how they work together, where the mind travels. I think it just helps them to feel more confident in the reasons why people are coming to yoga and why they are feeling the benefits. And then it brings in all the beautiful nuance of like how we might set up a yoga space, how we might decide if there's music playing or not, or what kind of adjustments are appropriate or not. We're kind of seeing these conversations come in about trauma informed or trauma aware yoga teacher trainings, yoga and mental health teacher trainings. And I think in the similar sense, bringing yoga and Ayurveda together, it just gives more scope to understand what could potentially be happening in a student's experience, and then assisting teachers in understanding their scope and feeling really confident and comfortable with that.
That makes sense because would sister sciences be the right term?
Yeah, sister science is absolutely the right
They
term.
kind of evolved together as practices
Yes.
traditionally. So if people would like to start continuing their education around Ayurveda, specifically yoga teachers, where should they start? What do you recommend?
So any texts by Dr. Vasant Lad are a really beautiful place to start. And next year, I'm actually going to be teaching a course, the Yoga of Ayurveda, which is going to be a 50-hour training for yoga teachers. And that is going to be released in April. So you can have a look on the website and see if that's of interest to you. But I think there's some really wonderful spaces where people can engage in learning. And I think that the site of your own body is also a really nice place to start. And I would ask people to try one thing and then experience that and make those decisions. Yeah, make those decisions for yourself if you are going to incorporate that practice or leave it to another time.
Beautiful. And how do you see teachers incorporating it into their classes with their students other than just understanding what they're teaching?
So I think that it's a really great resource for ideas for planning classes. There's all the beautiful understandings of the seasons. Like if we think of the elements and how the elements change with the season. So there's information that teachers can bring in that I know that students get excited about learning. And I think that it really informs choices about, what time of day are you teaching? So what dosha is alive at that time of day? Are you working with it, or are you trying to balance it out? If you're going to play some music, I think I said this earlier, but like if you're playing music and it's a particular time of day or you've got a particular focus, you can make choices that will really influence the experience of the yoga practice for the student.
I like that. That's very exciting. And then from like a marketing sort of perspective, since this is also what this podcast is about, I like the idea of being able to design your classes for the time of day, because presumably that's going to be more aligned for certain types of doshas at certain times of day as well.
Yeah.
So are you giving them a really balanced, as you mentioned, yin class or do they need something that's more energizing, depending on who your audience is?
And then if you're, teaching a class and you can provide options, right? That's another way of bringing that language in. Something that I do love about Ayurveda that I haven't mentioned is that it really leans away from value-based language. Like it's not inherently good to be dry or moist. It's not, it's not bad to be heavy or light. These are just these opposites that we're working with. And I think that language can be really nicely used in a yoga setting too, so that we're not making advanced asana better, right? Where it's invitational and we're talking about these qualities to create balance. So kind of taking out the hierarchy of what's better or what's good. And I think that when yoga teachers get together and learn those things, like it's really fun and it just expands kind of the opportunities to teach to people in a more expansive way.
That sounds really fun. I like that. And what are the top 3 things that you wish yoga teachers knew about Ayurveda?
The top 3 things. I think one thing is that Ayurveda and yoga are not in competition, that they're sister sciences, so they're inherently connected. Some people, I think, maybe not all, but like Ayurveda is not designed to be intimidating. There's so much that I think yoga teachers already know, because we're always half in the conversation already, just inherently through the different philosophies, like Sankhya philosophy, like we're all working on that same premise. And also that Ayurveda is very joyful and very fun.
I get that from listening to you talk about that. It sounds very fun and you're very excited about the practice.
Yeah, I am. I think I'm so excited about this pivot too in working with people, because I feel that even just talking about and imagining being in a room with yoga teachers is exciting, because it's a very specific kind of conversation. Not everyone is interested in talking Ayurveda. Like I've definitely tried it out on lots of friends and family. It doesn't light everybody up. But I think, groups of yoga teachers, Ayurveda practitioners, when we get together, it's such a celebration.
Yeah, beautiful. And if someone could just adopt one Ayurvedic practice, what would you recommend and why? That's probably a hard question since there's not one thing that suits all. Or what's the first thing they would learn, maybe?
I think if anyone ever tells you that this is the one thing you should do, is you should probably start studying somewhere else. But I think that it's so boring, but just sip on hot water, especially if you're an ice water lover. It's a real low risk place to start. And I think it gives pretty wonderful benefits pretty quickly.
And does that suit anyone's sort of constitution, or most people's
It's a pretty safe, I just had someone though ask about in the tropics. So in really hot places, just make you feel nauseous thinking about coming out in the morning and getting a hot water. So, if there's people who have headaches or super heavy periods or nausea, dizziness, we actually would recommend some cold water, but it's kind of used in a medicinal way. That in Ayurveda we say everything can be medicine and everything can be poison. It's about time, place, and circumstance. right? So like, who am I? What do I need right now? What's going on in my sphere? It's kind of how I start to make a decision about what I need the most. Yeah.
That's a good way of thinking about everything, just taking that moment. I know in Japanese culture, warm water as well is the preferred way of drinking it to better hydrate, which sort of makes sense in terms of your metabolism doesn't have to use much energy to assimilate it, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people notice on elimination, we haven't talked about that now, but if you go and see an Ayurvedic practitioner, they'll definitely ask you about your bowel movements, and making that work with a bit of ease is a wonderful start.
On that, if you want to start, is it better like studying these texts you mentioned, or should you go see an Ayurvedic practitioner for like a consult?
Yeah, I guess if you have some health related stuff, if you have some health related things, I would be speaking with a practitioner or a Vaidya. So in Ayurveda, there's people who have studied to become a doctor of Ayurveda, and we might use the word Vaidya. And I think those programs are largely based in India, some happening now in the States, but in association with some schools in India. And Panchakarma is the therapy that is a classic Ayurveda 2 weeks plus protocol that you do under the guidance of a Vaidya. It's very deep cleansing. So for more serious health issues, I would always recommend going to a Vaidya. Lots of great people out there. And then if you're kind of curious and you're pretty well and you're feeling like, oh, I want to expand my knowledge into Ayurveda, going to see an Ayurvedic practitioner or a health counselor is a great way, or finding, a yoga teacher training that includes Ayurveda that's taught by a practitioner or Vaidya. Yeah, it's just depends on who you are and where you are. There's some great courses out there. And for me, I just love studying in person. So that would be my go-to, but yeah, there's lots out there. And if you are a yoga teacher trainer or a yoga studio owner, collaborating with a practitioner, that's what I'm doing at the moment. So collaboration, as we were just talking about earlier, is just such a joy, and doing things in combination with different people from around the places. Yeah, makes things fun.
Yeah, it does. We were mentioning this before the thing. It's so much more fun for collaboration, marketing. I'm always a advocate for that. And we've come round to our rapid fire question for the end of the interview. So if you could turn to yourself in your first year of becoming a business owner or an entrepreneur, what advice would you give?
Yeah, I would just say trust your skill set. Because I've been a teacher for so long, I thought, I don't want to, I'm moving away from teaching, I'm moving towards Ayurveda, but it kept, niggling in there. So yeah, trust your skill set, or trust what you love. Guess they're maybe a bit synonymous in what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good advice. Thank you. And how can people connect to learn more? Where is the best place to find you?
Yeah, so my website is northayurveda.com.au, and I'm also on Instagram at northayurveda.
Awesome. I'll have all of those links in the show notes, and I'll also link so people can find out more about your course that's coming up, which sounds very exciting. If you're interested in learning more about Ayurveda, definitely go check that out. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lucy. I really appreciate it. It's been so much fun learning about Ayurveda, and yeah, it's such a fascinating, huge.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.